Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Dorothy Day's radical call to love rings louder for us today than the servile state solution ever will. We're joined by Thomas Diaz to talk about what's happening in New York. Thomas is the author of Zohran Mamdani is Not Radical Enough, published in the Public Discourse. He is the Foundation Relations Specialist at the Acton Institute. Thomas, great to speak with you. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on, Marcus.
Very glad to have you on. Tell us about, so you start by saying Dorothy Day would not have voted for Zohran Mamdani. Before we talk about Mamdani and his policies and some of his presuppositions, give us an overarching view of how Dorothy Day viewed social flourishing.
Yeah, no, Dorothy Day, she was a 20th century social activist, and she was very much what she would say a personalist, and also, a distributist and a communitarian. And those words, they mean really like she believed that social flourishing was a matter of people personally following Christ's example, taking the responsibility to love one another face to face, doing works of mercy for one another, and living together in community. And this kind of decentralized, very personal view and communal view of flourishing is what drove her work for her entire life.
In that light, it's right to say that she was very concerned with social doctrine from the lens of her faith.
Yes, no doubt. And, her ideological stances and philosophical and political stances took a very long evolution over the course of her life. Her early life, she was very much involved in the left-wing movements in America, the communists, socialists, and she was deeply attracted to their kind of zeal for justice for the poor and for the oppressed. And when she converted to Catholicism, and one of the things that actually really drew her to Catholicism was, especially at that time, the church's identification with the poor. And especially in America, Catholicism was very much a religion of the poor. And she, as a left-winger, had a great sympathy for that. And it drew her to be in solidarity with the poor. And not only that, but the church's, obviously metaphysical and social teachings led her to believe in the poor, not just as flesh and bones, but as Jesus himself, as Jesus would say, what you do to these brothers of mine, you do to me. And that provided a real metaphysical, spiritual basis for her very personal approach to charity and to the works of mercy and to feeding and clothing the poor.
Now, share with us some of the things she did, including the Catholic worker movement, those things that showed that she really did start some concrete activities.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. On the one hand, she was throughout her life, a self-professed anarchist. And so she was deeply skeptical of institutional solutions to any kind of social ill, whether that be the state, as my article talks about, or corporations. But in a way, she did kind of start her own institutions, although they were in her anarchist spirit, and along with her co-founder, Peter Morin, they were very kind of decentralized. And so she started the Catholic worker movement and founded houses of hospitality that would feed the poor, clothe the poor. That she would make soup for them, and she would let people who needed help, the homeless people, the poor, stay in those houses. And even when people would ask her, someone would ask her how long can they stay, she would say forever. There's stories even of somebody staying at a Catholic worker farm. They also started farms, and these organizations still exist. Somebody who's deeply troubled and deeply, he was a racist person, he was anti-Semitic, and he stayed, and they let him stay, and he stayed for 10 years, and causing Dorothy Day all kinds of grief. But that was the radicality of her hospitality. And the Catholic worker movement still exists today. And again, it's very decentralized and spread all over the world, but it takes care of people. People take care of people there, and they also do activism on all different types of topics, social topics, to this day.
Did she have a particular affirmation and loyalty to the city of New York?
She was born there, and then she lived in different places. Her father was a sports writer, and so she lived in San Francisco, she lived in Chicago. But really, she came back to New York, and she didn't leave much after that. And she was, especially, she was drawn into the social and political milieu of the city. I mean, the different movements and literary and artistic and political movements that were going on. Like I was saying, the left-wing political movements, but also artistic. She was acquainted with Eugene O'Neill, the great playwright. And then that's where she started the Catholic worker movement with Peter Morin. And so it kept her there. But also, it was a place she lived there. I mean, she was not married, but she was, before her conversion, living with another man in Staten Island. And so New York really, she was a true New Yorker, and stayed there for really the remainder of her life.
Now, with the deep love that someone like Dorothy Day had, both for New York in general, but in specificity, the social flourishing for fellow human persons, can we now talk about the advent of Zohran Mamdani?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, Zohran Mamdani is definitely taken the world by storm in dislodging the kind of democratic establishment in New York City, which has dominated New York City politics for so long. There hasn't been a Republican mayor since Rudy Giuliani, and he has this kind of aura around him. First of all, he's a very charismatic person. He is deeply personable. He'll go out. His campaign was spectacular in the way he went out onto the street and related to New Yorkers. But in a way, this kind of personable approach attracted a whole new crowd of voters, especially young voters, that came out to vote for the first time zealously for Zohran, thinking that he was somebody who really cared about solving the issues. He was somebody who really, really cared and wanted to do something about solving the homelessness problem, the housing problem, all of these things, which he promised to do. But really, his solutions are nothing particularly new or nothing particularly radical. He is a statist. He thinks that the government can solve these issues by taking care of people's housing, giving people free childcare, making buses free, government-owned supermarkets. Like that, it's the government that needs to do more. And people were drawn in by this kind of seemingly can-do radical approach to solving these problems, but it's not anything particularly different from general progressive politics in the world today and democratic politics. And I wanted to contrast that to Dorothy Day's approach, which is, no, we cannot let the state solve all our problems or try to solve all our problems, lest people become dependent and lose their dignity by becoming dependent on the state that just feeds them coldly and bureaucratically. And so I try to point out in my article that Zohran is this, even though he has this kind of very energetic personality and can-do attitude, his real policies are not particularly radical.
Just knowing the history of socialism, or whatever way he wants to couch it, collectivism, democratic socialism, knowing how history has borne out, it's amazing that he is as popular as he is. And I want to invite that comment on the other side of the break. I'm talking with Thomas Diaz. Thomas is the Foundation Relations Specialist at the Acton Institute, and he has penned an article in the public discourse called Zohran Mamdani is Not Radical Enough, and he's contrasting Mamdani's position and beliefs to Dorothy Day and her own faith-informed beliefs. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, talking with Thomas Diaz, Foundation Relations Specialist at the Acton Institute, and we're talking about Zohran Mamdani in contraposition to Dorothy Day. We were just talking earlier, Thomas, about. I was going to ask you your thoughts on why Zohran's policies, despite history bearing the fact that none of these policies really yield good fruit. In fact, they tend to be detrimental in the long run. Why is it so popular for especially the young to desire this kind of socialism?
Well, I think, even Dorothy Day's own life testifies to this attractiveness of socialism as well. That, socialism, it has this kind of, socialists have this energy to them, this kind of zeal, this kind of energetic and magnetic zeal to them, that they really, really care about the poor, and that they are willing to put their bodies and their lives on the line to do what is necessary for justice for the poor. And, you see this, like, for example, with Zohran Mamdani, right? He was he went to strikes, Starbucks strikes, sit-ins, hunger strikes. He's the type of person that you think, he really walks the walk, and he does what he really does care. And that attracts young people who have this energy and zeal to change the world. And I think that is just the timeless kind of magnetism that that socialism has. And again, like, this is mirrored in Dorothy Day's own life, that she started in those movements in the early 20th century. And she saw a contrast, really, even between the church and the leftist movements she was a part of. That the leftist movements had a real zeal to them, and that they really cared about people. And she saw that, Christ's example was the kind of true root of all of that, and that taken in its fullest expression. But I think, you're absolutely right. These things do not work. And ultimately, compared to Catholicism, compared to the religion of Christ, they do not have that love that Christ has. And this is what Dorothy Day realized, that these problems are not because the state or the government is not doing enough. It's because we are not loving enough. And that is what led her to leave those movements and to convert to Catholicism.
You also make the point of noting that, by comparison, the kind of radical charity of Dorothy Day is way more radical than Mamdani. In fact, if anything, Mamdani's policies come across as more moderate. Help us understand what that means.
Yeah, and as I had mentioned, Mamdani's policies are more of the same, right? He has this kind of aesthetic, like I was saying, of putting his own self personally on the line to fight for justice for the oppressed, to go out and strike, to go out and be alongside the people and workers. But his actual policies, right, using the state as a vehicle to solve all of society's social ills, is something that has been tried again and again and again. It does not work. Government housing, talking about childcare and free buses and government-run supermarkets. All these things have been tried before, and it's a pretty standard and almost easy answer to these problems. All we have to do is pass some laws, right? Add some new taxes, and we don't really have to do much. Just let the government handle it, and they'll fix these problems. That is not Dorothy's solution at all. Dorothy's solution is radical, and it calls each one of us personally to go out and roll up our sleeves and be side by side with the poor and clothe them personally and feed them personally, and not use the state, which is so often a tool of domination, as the vehicle for that. Lest, as I was saying, people become dependent on the state, which she believed was so below the dignity of people, that people need to be taken care of by other human beings doing it out of the love of their heart, not by government bureaucrats And she saw that the personal love owed to these people is what was fitting of their dignity, and that's what people should be doing. And so that's a much more difficult thing to do and radical thing to do than to hope the government solves it for you.
So let's go back then to the way Mamdani believes the government can be the solution to everything. Like you've rightly highlighted, there's an avenue here of misplaced charity, a feigned warmth. The government cares in a way that even God doesn't. Can you please speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, and especially, again, in the kind of aesthetic of socialism, of left-wing movements that are, again, so often dominated by the young, as it is now, and as these movements have always been in Dorothy Day's time as well, that we have to fight the power because those in power are evil, and we have to basically fight against them and their injustices and seize power for ourselves so that we have good people who actually care in power. And it's that kind of view that, if only we just have our people in power, that everything will go okay, is that naive view that, as I was speaking to, is much easier in a way, a kind of easier solution than we need to all get together and take care of one another. And what real warmth, what real love, as you were saying, is you personally going out and taking care of people and forming strong communities, right, which often takes decades of commitment to maybe a particular neighborhood or a particular place in order to revitalize it, in order to serve it properly. And the idea that the government could do that, or that the government could pay people to do such a thing, right, is not particularly warm or loving at all, right? It's people getting, right, and not to say that government workers don't do good things, because they absolutely do, and they are good-hearted people who want a career that do well at taking care for others, but doing that in a government structure is much colder than what Dorothy Day imagined, which is communities taking care of one another personally out of the love of their hearts.
Speaking from an historical perspective, what tends to happen when you try to legislate what is ostensibly compassion for your fellow man? Well,
very often it can crowd out those kind of natural sources of love and sustainable sources of love that are really what sustain taking care of one another in a community. So you're talking about the family, for example, right? Dorothy Day, as I write, would not have been for Zohran's idea of free childcare, because the family should take care of its own, right? We should not be incentivizing people to outsource the care of their own children to the state to take care of the children for them. The family is very important as where we learn how to love and learn how to take care of one another, and so families should do that for them, do that themselves. And when the state comes in and crowds out that mechanism, makes it easier to outsource that love, try and outsource that love to someone else, and that's where it dissipates. Same kind of thing with churches. If the government is the one feeding people, churches, right? The churches kind of lose that charitable place in society, and they tend to dissipate. But of course, those church communities are where people learn how to love, and they learn Christ's love as well. And so oftentimes the state, and Dorothy Day is very aware of this, grows more and more and more to crowd out these other important institutions that teach love.
Thomas, thank you very much for making the time to share with us this.
Thank you, Marcus.
My guest has been Thomas Diaz, Foundation Relations Specialist at Acton Institute. We've been talking about his article in the public discourse, Zohran Mamdani is not radical enough, and essentially why history bears out that charity cannot be legislated. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter.